Marlon Brando leaned forward at the Tonight Show desk, his famously guarded expression suddenly and completely open, and said 6 words that made Johnny Carson set down his note cards entirely. Several people present later described this specific gesture, Carson deliberately setting aside his prepared material, as a genuinely rare occurrence that signaled, before Brando had even finished his sentence, exactly how significant this particular moment was about to become. It was April 17th, 1972, 11:47 p.m., NBC Studios in Burbank, and the man whose smoldering, unpredictable screen presence had redefined American acting for 2 full decades was about to reveal something he had kept private for nearly a decade. A secret involving one of the most important writers in the country, and a debt that Brando had quietly paid off, one small piece at a time, without ever once seeking any public credit for it. Coming up, exactly what Marlon Brando had actually done for James Baldwin during one of the most dangerous and most financially precarious periods of Baldwin's entire life, the specific reason Brando had never told anyone about it, and what happened when Johnny Carson realized he was hearing something that had never once appeared in any newspaper, any interview, or any public record anywhere. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comments section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way, you're part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's get into what happened that night, because what almost nobody watching that broadcast understood was that one of the most famously guarded and famously private actors in American history had been quietly protecting a friend for nearly a decade, and had decided, for reasons even he seemed to be discovering in real time, that this was finally the night to say so. Marlon Brando and James Baldwin met in New York in the late 1940s, both young men still years away from the fame that would eventually make each of them one of the defining cultural figures of his respective field. Brando establishing himself in the city's competitive theater scene, Baldwin working as a writer while supporting himself through a series of considerably less glamorous jobs. Their friendship developed within the specific and considerably bohemian intellectual circles of post-war Greenwich Village, a community that brought together writers, actors, and artists across lines of race and background, with a specific openness that remained genuinely unusual for that particular era of American cultural life. Both men frequented the same small handful of coffee houses and cramped apartment gatherings that defined this particular intellectual scene, evenings that stretched late into the night, filled with genuinely passionate debate about literature, politics, and the specific moral obligations of art within a country still working through the earliest stages of its reckoning with entrenched racial injustice. Brando, already displaying the intense and searching intellectual curiosity that would eventually inform his own considerable artistic career, found himself genuinely drawn to Baldwin's particular combination of literary brilliance and moral seriousness, a combination Brando later described in one of his own rare reflections on their friendship as unlike anything else he encountered among the considerable circle of talented people he associated with during those formative years. Both men, according to people who knew them during this period, recognized in each other a shared and considerable intensity, an unwillingness to accept conventional answers to difficult questions, and a specific kind of restless intelligence that made their friendship, from its earliest days, considerably deeper than ordinary social acquaintance. This early recognition of shared temperament proved remarkably durable, sustaining their friendship across 4 subsequent decades despite the considerable differences in their respective public trajectories, Brando ascending toward extraordinary and largely unprecedented cinematic fame, while Baldwin built his own distinct and equally significant reputation as one of the essential literary voices of 20th century American letters. What almost nobody in the general American public fully understood was the specific and considerable financial precarity that defined much of James Baldwin's life throughout the 1950s and well into the 1960s, precarity that persisted despite his genuine and increasingly recognized literary talent, driven substantially by the specific difficulty black writers faced securing consistent publishing income and lucrative opportunities within an industry that remained, throughout this period, overwhelmingly controlled by white publishers and white editors with limited interest in aggressively promoting black literary voices, regardless of their genuine artistic merit. Baldwin's specific and considerable literary trajectory during this exact period deserves fuller understanding because it illustrates exactly how genuine artistic recognition did not necessarily translate into genuine financial stability for a black writer navigating this particular publishing landscape. His early novels and essay collections received considerable critical acclaim, establishing him as one of the most significant literary voices of his generation. Yet the actual financial compensation for this critical success remained, by the standards of comparably acclaimed white writers of the same era, genuinely and considerably modest, a specific disparity that reflected broader and deeply entrenched patterns of unequal compensation throughout the publishing industry. Baldwin frequently found himself, even during periods of considerable critical success, genuinely uncertain about his ability to cover basic living expenses, a precarity that stood in stark contrast to the public perception of him as an increasingly celebrated and increasingly influential literary figure. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment, because what happens on that stage in a few minutes reveals a secret that Marlon Brando had kept for nearly a decade. Baldwin's specific financial precarity intensified considerably during the early 1960s, a period when his own increasingly outspoken and increasingly influential writing on American racial injustice made him, simultaneously, one of the most celebrated literary voices of his generation and one of the most publicly targeted, receiving genuine and credible threats connected directly to his writing and his public advocacy, threats that created additional and largely invisible costs, security concerns, legal consultations, and periods when Baldwin found it genuinely difficult to secure stable housing given landlords' reluctance to rent to someone whose public profile made them a potential target for harassment or worse. The specific nature of these threats deserves careful and fuller documentation because they illustrate exactly how genuinely dangerous Baldwin's public advocacy actually made his daily life during this period. He received, according to accounts given by people close to him during these years, a consistent stream of threatening correspondence connected directly to his published writing on racial injustice, threats specific enough in their content that Baldwin periodically found it necessary to consult with legal counsel and, on at least several occasions, to arrange temporary and considerably more expensive alternative housing when his regular residence began to feel genuinely unsafe. These specific and largely invisible costs, security consultations, temporary relocations, legal fees, accumulated steadily throughout this period, creating a specific financial burden that existed entirely separate from his ordinary living expenses and that few of his readers, admiring his published work from a considerable and comfortable distance, ever had any occasion to fully understand or appreciate. According to an account eventually confirmed by one of Brando's closest and most trusted associates decades later, Brando learned, sometime in early 1963, of the specific severity of Baldwin's financial circumstances during this period, information that reached him through a mutual friend who mentioned in what was intended as ordinary conversation, that Baldwin had been forced to delay several considerable medical expenses due to genuine financial constraint. Brando, according to this account, made a specific and immediate decision that he communicated to almost nobody at the time, quietly arranging, through an intermediary rather than direct personal contact, to cover these specific medical expenses without Baldwin ever learning the actual source of this unexpected financial relief. Brando, by this point in his own career, had achieved considerable financial success following his own significant early triumphs in both theater and film, a level of financial security that he understood, according to his own later reflections, placed him in a genuinely rare position relative to most of his own artistic peers, a position he apparently felt a specific and considerable obligation to use meaningfully rather than simply accumulating for his own private benefit or ordinary personal comfort. This was, according to the account eventually given decades later, only the beginning of a pattern that Brando maintained, quietly and consistently, for the following several years. He arranged, through the same trusted intermediary, periodic and carefully anonymous financial support during periods when Baldwin's own literary income proved genuinely insufficient to cover his living expenses, support that Baldwin, according to this same account, never definitively traced back to Brando during the entire period it was actually occurring, though Baldwin apparently developed private suspicions about the source that he chose, for reasons of his own, never to directly confirm or investigate. According to the intermediary's own later account, the specific rhythm of this support followed no predictable schedule, arriving instead whenever the intermediary, monitoring Baldwin's circumstances through their own ongoing professional relationship with him, determined that genuine need had arisen, a specific pattern of responsive rather than routine generosity that required Brando to maintain, across nearly a decade, a genuine and sustained attention to his friend's circumstances despite the considerable demands of his own increasingly prominent film career during this exact period. The specific mechanics of this arrangement deserve fuller understanding, because they illustrate exactly how deliberately and how carefully Brando worked to ensure his own name never became attached to this support in any way that might reach Baldwin directly or reach any broader public awareness. Brando used a mutual friend, a literary agent with connections to both men, as the sole intermediary for these transactions, providing funds through this agent with explicit and repeated instructions that Baldwin never be told the actual source, understanding, according to what Brando later explained, that Baldwin possessed a considerable and genuine pride that might make him refuse the assistance entirely if he understood it originated from a wealthy movie star, rather than from some more anonymous or more institutionally legitimate source. The specific care Brando took to maintain this anonymity deserves fuller documentation, because it illustrates exactly how deliberately he worked to protect Baldwin's dignity throughout this entire arrangement. He instructed the literary agent to frame each specific instance of support in terms that suggested institutional or foundation-based origin rather than any individual benefactor. A careful fiction maintained consistently across nearly a decade, specifically to spare Baldwin the particular discomfort Brando anticipated he would feel accepting direct personal charity from a considerably wealthier friend. This specific attention to preserving Baldwin's sense of independence and self-sufficiency, even while providing genuine and substantial material support, reflected a sophistication of generosity that several people who eventually learned of the arrangement described as considerably more thoughtful than the ordinary and often clumsier forms of celebrity philanthropy that characterized much of that era's charitable giving. Johnny Carson had booked Marlon Brando for that evening's broadcast for entirely ordinary reasons, a rare and considerably anticipated appearance given Brando's well-documented and consistent reluctance to participate in television interviews throughout the majority of his extensive career. an appearance built around discussion of his recent and considerable professional resurgence. Carson's production team had spent considerable time and effort securing this particular booking, understanding that Brando's television appearances were genuinely rare enough that this particular evening represented a significant programming achievement, regardless of the specific direction the conversation ultimately took. Brando himself had agreed to the appearance somewhat reluctantly, according to his own management at the time, motivated substantially by professional considerations connected to his recent film work, rather than any particular enthusiasm for the television interview format itself, a reluctance that made the eventual depth and eventual candor of the conversation considerably more surprising to everyone involved, including Brando's own representatives, who had prepared him for a considerably more guarded and considerably more superficial evening than what actually transpired. The broadcast began with the specific and somewhat guarded quality that had characterized virtually every one of Brando's rare public appearances, the actor offering thoughtful but carefully measured responses to Carson's questions, revealing considerably less about his own private life and private convictions than most guests typically volunteered. Roughly 21 minutes into the broadcast, Carson, aware of Brando's own well-documented history of civil rights activism, asked him a broad and largely open-ended question about which specific relationships or specific causes had most significantly shaped his own understanding of racial justice across his considerable career. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Marlon Brando was quiet for a long moment, and several people present described a specific and unmistakable shift in his characteristically guarded expression, something considerably more open and considerably more vulnerable beginning to surface. He said that he had never publicly discussed a specific secret he had carried for nearly a decade, and that something about the particular sincerity of Carson's question, rather than the more superficial curiosity such questions typically carried, had made him feel, for the first time in his extensive and carefully guarded public career, that perhaps the moment had finally arrived to share it. He leaned forward at the desk and said, quietly enough, that the studio audience had to lean forward themselves to fully register what he was saying, that he had spent nearly a decade quietly helping to support James Baldwin financially during some of the most difficult and most dangerous years of Baldwin's life, support that Baldwin himself had likely never definitively confirmed came from him, and support that Brando had never once discussed publicly until this exact moment. Several people present described the specific and remarkable quality of watching Brando's own famously guarded public persona, developed across decades of careful and deliberate resistance to conventional celebrity self-disclosure, finally and completely dissolve in this exact moment, a transformation that several members of the production staff later specifically identified as one of the most genuinely surprising, unscripted moments any guest had ever produced on that particular stage. Brando's own representatives, watching from the wings, reportedly exchanged visibly startled glances with each other, having genuinely believed, based on their extensive prior experience managing his public appearances, that this level of personal disclosure fell entirely outside anything Brando would ever willingly share in a public broadcast setting. Brando described, for the first time in any public setting, the specific circumstances that had first prompted his involvement, the medical expenses he had quietly covered, and the subsequent years of periodic and carefully anonymous financial support he had arranged through a trusted intermediary specifically to protect both Baldwin's privacy and Baldwin's considerable personal pride. He recounted the specific texture of that first phone call to the intermediary, describing his own decision-making process as remarkably swift and remarkably uncomplicated, a specific and immediate conviction that helping his friend mattered considerably more than any careful deliberation about the specific logistics or specific long-term commitment, such assistance might eventually require. He said that he had made this specific choice, protecting his own identity as the actual source of this support, because he understood that Baldwin, a writer whose entire public identity was built around unflinching honesty and considerable personal dignity, would likely have found it genuinely difficult to accept direct charity from a wealthy white movie star, regardless of how genuine the underlying friendship actually was. Brando elaborated further, describing his own considerable and careful reflection on the specific dynamics of race and privilege that made this particular question of anonymous support genuinely complicated rather than simply a straightforward act of generosity between friends. He said that he had spent a considerable amount of time privately wrestling with the specific question of whether his own support, however well-intentioned, risked reproducing exactly the kind of paternalistic racial dynamic that Baldwin's own writing had spent considerable energy critiquing, a genuine and thoughtful concern that had shaped his decision to maintain such careful anonymity throughout the entire arrangement, understanding that the specific manner of giving mattered nearly as much as the material support itself. Johnny Carson, listening to this account with genuine and evident emotion, asked Brando why he had finally decided to reveal this particular secret on this particular evening, given that he had successfully protected it for nearly 10 years. Brando said that he had recently learned, through the same trusted intermediary, that Baldwin's own financial circumstances had genuinely and considerably stabilized in recent years, meaning that the original reason for maintaining such careful secrecy, protecting Baldwin from the specific vulnerability of financial dependence during a genuinely precarious period, no longer applied with the same urgency. He said that he had decided, reflecting on this development, that the story actually belonged, in some sense, to the broader public record of what genuine friendship across racial lines had actually required during one of the most difficult periods in recent American history, rather than remaining permanently buried simply because he personally preferred to avoid public credit for it. The studio audience, 300 people who had come expecting the guarded and carefully measured conversation that had characterized the broadcast's opening minutes, sat in a silence that several people present described as the most complete and most genuinely moved silence they experienced at a live television taping, watching one of American cinema's most famously private and most famously guarded actors reveal, for the first time in any public setting, a nearly decade-long secret of genuine and considerable generosity toward one of the most important writers of his generation. Several audience members, interviewed by entertainment reporters in the days following the broadcast, described the specific and unusual privilege of witnessing this particular revelation. One audience member, a young writer who specifically admired Baldwin's published work, told a reporter that watching Brando's disclosure had given her a considerably more complete and considerably more hopeful understanding of what genuine cross-racial friendship and genuine cross-racial solidarity could actually look like in practice. Evidence that famous and seemingly distant public figures were capable of exactly the kind of sustained, thoughtful care that she had always hoped, but rarely seen publicly documented, existed within the entertainment industry's considerable and often self-interested public relations machinery. What followed was a considerably longer and more genuinely candid conversation than either the audience or the production staff had anticipated. Brando discussing, with an openness he had never displayed in any of his previous rare television appearances, the specific texture of his friendship with Baldwin, their shared history in post-war Greenwich Village, and the particular and continuing significance of using whatever privilege and whatever resources he personally possessed to support friends and causes that genuinely mattered, rather than simply expressing sympathy from a position of comfortable and considerable personal safety. Brando spoke, in particular, about his own considerable and ongoing discomfort with the specific privilege his own fame and his own financial success afforded him, A privilege he said he had spent considerable time across his career trying to understand and trying to use responsibly rather than simply accepting as an unremarkable feature of his own success. Carson listened throughout with genuine and evident fascination, understanding that Brando was offering, in this exact conversation, a considerably more complete and considerably more philosophically developed account of his own political and ethical convictions than audiences had ever previously had access to across his entire notoriously guarded public career. NBC's switchboard, according to production staff who monitored it, received an overwhelming volume of calls in the days following the broadcast, viewers writing and calling specifically to express their genuine admiration for the specific quality of Brando's quiet and consistent generosity. Generosity that had apparently continued for nearly a decade, with absolutely no expectation of public acknowledgement or public credit. Several of these callers specifically mentioned their own experiences either giving or receiving quiet, unpublicized generosity, describing a particular resonance in learning that one of America's most famous and most fiercely private actors had maintained this level of sustained personal commitment entirely outside public view. One caller, a social worker who spent her career connecting people in genuine financial crisis with available resources, told a production staff member that she found Brando's specific attention to preserving Baldwin's dignity throughout the arrangement particularly instructive, noting that she had witnessed, in her own professional experience, how frequently well-intentioned charitable giving inadvertently caused genuine harm to recipients' sense of independence and self-respect, precisely the harm Brando had worked so deliberately to avoid. This response, echoed across the substantial volume of calls and letters NBC received in the following weeks, suggested that what had happened on that stage had touched something considerably larger than the specific story of one famous actor's private generosity, a broader recognition among viewers about what genuinely thoughtful and genuinely respectful giving actually required. Marlon Brando and James Baldwin remained close friends for the remainder of Baldwin's life, and according to people who knew both men, their friendship, already considerable before this broadcast, deepened further once Baldwin eventually learned the full truth about who had actually been supporting him during those difficult years. Baldwin's own reaction to finally learning the truth, according to accounts given by mutual friends who witnessed the aftermath, involved a complicated mixture of genuine gratitude and a specific and somewhat wounded pride at having accepted assistance for years without knowing its actual source, a complexity that both men apparently discussed directly and at considerable length once Baldwin's suspicions were finally confirmed. Rather than damaging their friendship, this eventual conversation seemed, according to these same accounts, to deepen it considerably, both men arriving at a shared understanding of exactly what genuine care for another person's well-being combined with genuine respect for that person's dignity and autonomy actually required in practice rather than simply in theory. James Baldwin died on December 1st, 1987, and Marlon Brando, in a private letter to a mutual friend that was eventually published after Brando's own death, specifically referenced their decades of friendship and described Baldwin as one of the most genuinely brilliant and most genuinely courageous people he had ever known, a writer whose work had shaped his own understanding of American racial injustice more profoundly than any other single influence across his entire life. This particular letter, written in the immediate aftermath of Baldwin's death, contained several passages that specifically referenced the years of quiet financial support Brando had provided, describing it, in his own words, as one of the very few things he had done across his entire complicated and extensively documented public life that he felt genuinely and entirely proud of, without any reservation whatsoever, precisely because it had never been performed for any audience or any public recognition, existing instead purely as a private expression of genuine care between two men who had recognized in each other, from their very earliest days of friendship, something worth protecting across the following 4 decades. Marlon Brando himself died on July 1, 2004, and several of his own obituaries specifically referenced his quiet and largely undocumented support of Baldwin as one of the more genuinely admirable and more genuinely private aspects of a public life that was, in most other respects, extensively and thoroughly documented. Several of these obituaries specifically noted the particular irony that one of the most publicly scrutinized figures in American entertainment history had managed to keep this specific and genuinely significant act of generosity almost entirely private for nearly a decade, a testament to exactly how deliberately and how carefully he had guarded this particular piece of his personal history, until finally choosing, on his own terms and in his own time, to share it. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be understood, something that connects the entire arc of Brando and Baldwin's remarkable friendship back to what happened on that Tonight Show stage, years after both men had passed away, when biographers and historians began examining the full scope of their extraordinary and largely undocumented friendship for various retrospective projects. Several specifically identified this particular broadcast as one of the only genuine primary sources available describing the actual substance of Brando's support, given that virtually no other documentation of the arrangement survived in either man's personal papers, a specific and deliberate absence that itself reflected exactly how completely both men had honored the original spirit of quiet, unpublicized generosity that had defined the entire decade-long arrangement. One biographer, writing about Baldwin's life and legacy, noted that this broadcast provided a rare and genuinely valuable window into exactly what authentic solidarity across racial and class lines actually looked like when practiced with genuine thoughtfulness and genuine respect for the recipient's dignity, rather than the more performative and more self-congratulatory forms of celebrity philanthropy that became considerably more common in the decades that followed. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the quiet, unpublicized generosity you might be capable of extending to the people in your own life who genuinely need it. Generosity that requires no public credit and no public acknowledgement to be genuinely meaningful. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that genuine generosity often happens most powerfully in complete privacy, entirely disconnected from any expectation of public recognition. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the private generosity behind some of America's most celebrated public figures, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, and telling me about a moment of quiet, unpublicized generosity you witnessed or experienced that never received any public credit at all. The kind of generosity that mattered most precisely because nobody else ever knew about it.